Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. We are continuing with our reading of Iqbal's reconstruction of religious thought in Islam, and we are looking at his comments about infinity and the relationship between finite and infinite. So we had looked at this last time, and we'll continue from here. The idea that thought is essentially finite. It should be noted here that the way he is thinking, Iqbal is using thinking or thought amounts to what we call hypostatization, and that is also very similar to what Hegel does. I'll just explain what it means in a minute. So hypostatization to hypostatize mean to literally it means to regard something as real, or it also means to embody, personify. But in philosophy, we use hypostatization to mean something related but not quite the same. What we mean by hypostatization is, in this context anyway, so we distinguish between things which are self-standing, and obviously this is the relative term, self-standing. In Arabic we can call it qaim bizat. And those things which are, and there are things which are self-standing in relative term, and then there are things which are not self-standing. That is, they need something else to stand. To stand on or stand with the help of. In this context, for example, we can say that Zaid, a person's name, or Amir, or John, they are self-standing in relative terms. John is clever, Amir is smart, and Zaid is sharp. And these things like being clever and sharp and smart, these are qualities. And generally we think that sharpness cannot self-stand. It needs to personify and embody in something. So Zaid can be sharp, so sharpness needs somebody to stand on or embody itself in, or personify itself in. So hypostatization is, in philosophy, happens when we treat qualities, non-self-standing things, and pretend as if they are self-standing. That is hypostatization. So that's what Hegel does, and that's what Iqbal is doing here. So thinking or thought are qualities or functions. They are not self-standing. They are not self-standing as far as we think of them. So thinking cannot exist on its own according to our general understanding. But there are philosophers like Hegel and Plato who think that qualities can self-stand. And that's why Aristotle criticized his teacher Plato's theory of ideas or universals precisely on this basis. So here Iqbal is using thought as if it is something self-subsisting or self-standing. But in fact, as far as we can see, thinking and thought are something which cannot self-subsist. They need something else to stand on, like Ali or Iqbal. They think. And thinking itself cannot think or stand on its own or exist on its own as far as our normal understanding goes. But Hegel thought that thought is something self-subsisting or self-standing. I mean, in a sense, it always needs something to personify itself or embody itself in. So it always uses particulars, so it needs particulars in that sense. But it is something which is expressing itself in or and through particulars. And that's what history is all about. The movement of thought, self-expressing itself or developing itself, depending on how you want to read it. This Hegelian idea can be read in more conservative terms as well as more revolutionary terms. If you think it has a potentiality, then it is more conservative reading. But if you say that it is developing itself, then that can be read in a more revolutionary terms. But that thought in that sense is what God is for him, and that's and so in a sense he realizes that thought needs particulars. But by doing that, he doesn't concede that thought is not something beyond particular or something which exists in itself. It's only saying that it develops itself through its particular manifestations, but it cannot be reduced to those particular manifestations, and that's what creates movement in history. Anyway, so that's the thing I wanted to note at the start here. So let's go back to the text. So the idea that thought is essentially finite. So he's talking of thought as if it is something self-standing. Something self-standing. The thought is essentially finite. And for this reason unable to capture the infinite. So if thought is something finite, it cannot capture or understand infinite. But Iqbal is saying that it's based on a mistaken notion of the movement of thought in knowledge. Movement of thought in knowledge. So thinking is a movement. Thinking is a movement because of what I just said, but I'll come back to that. So thinking and knowledge. So let's look at this for a minute. So we have a few concepts here. So we have thought, and then we have finite. So the idea that thought is finite is being rejected. Now, in a sense, both Iqbal and Hegel realize that thought is actually finite, in a sense that if it wasn't finite, where would the movement come from? Because supposedly finite is something which is complete. And if we go by Aristotelian notion of movement, so movement is basically deprivation. That's why our mutakallimin who were schooled in Aristotelian or pseudo-Aristotelian philosophy, they had a hard time understanding the Quranic verses where it talks about God, moving in a sense. And so they try to interpret it in a way that this apparent meaning is, apparent meaning is removed, I guess. Anyway, so finite, in a sense, it is finite for both Hegel and Iqbal. The thought is finite in the sense that it has a movement, but they think that's the. I'll come back to that. That's the wrong conception of finite. At the end, both Iqbal and Hegel would say that finite and infinite are not opposed to each other. They are part and parcel of each other. We will get back to that. But just to focus on this sentence we just read, where he said that the idea that thought is essentially finite and for this reason unable to capture the infinite. So thought, firstly, we are treating thought as if it is something self-subsisting. So if it is finite, so that's the story goes. If thought is finite, as it is presumably according to Kant and Ghazali, then it cannot capture infinite. Why? Because infinite by definition is beyond the grasp, or at least full grasp of finite. Because if finite can capture infinite, then it won't be finite. As Quran says, La tudrikul absar, La tudrikuhul absar. And absar doesn't just mean our physical eyes, but also our cognition. Anyway, so if thought is finite, then it cannot capture infinite. Okay. But Iqbal says that the idea that thought is essentially finite. So he's not denying that thought might be finite in its manifestation, but it is not essentially finite. That essential will become important later. So the idea that thought is essentially finite, and for this reason, if it is essentially finite thought, then it cannot grasp fully infinite, like through its devices, that is. concepts and ideas, etc. So if then infinite will always transcend our thought, even if we capture some of it or some glimpses of it. So, but Iqbal saying the idea that thought is essentially finite and for this reason unable to capture the infinite is based on a mistaken notion of the movement of thought in knowledge. This idea is mistaken. Hegel will say this idea is false. A similar sort of words. Iqbal was taught by Hegelians, yeah. So this idea is false. False notion of movement. This mistaken notion of the movement of thought in knowledge. And I think so there is a movement because there's always a gap between thought and knowledge, otherwise there's no movement. But the notion which is mistaken is that knowledge is outside. According to Hegel and Iqbal, a thought is outside knowledge. So we think of thought as, for example, we say there's thought and that's a being. And that's why there's a movement, because there is a gap between, essential gap between, or at least from our perspective, essential gap between thought and being. And when thought then correspond to being, then we say it's knowledge. For both Iqbal and Hegel, this is a mistaken view or false view of the movement of thought and knowledge. And first mistake is that we think that thought is outside being, essentially, but this is not. Because if being is outside thought, it means thought is essentially finite. So there's no essential gap between, according to thought and being. And being, in a sense, potentially in thought, or being is a dormant thought, and thought is or being is expression of thoughts. So only if we think that being is outside, essentially outside thought, then we would think that thought cannot grasp the being or infinite. But if thought and being are interrelated, and if being is a self-expression of thought, or thought is self-expression of being, then this dichotomy between knowledge and thought itself vanishes. So Iqbal and Hegel both would argue something similar. And they will come. We won't have time to do this today, but we'll come back to that. So thought and being, and hence thought and being and knowledge, they are basically unfolding of each other. And if there's nothing outside, So in that sense, thought is infinite and being is infinite. Essentially, it's only from certain perspective that thought looked finite, and that's where movement come from. So yeah, and then Hegel goes on to distinguish between two types of infinities. Bad infinity, and the other one is genuine infinity. So genuine infinity is the one which is not opposed to finite. It actually contains finite within itself. Mistaken and false infinity or bad infinity is the infinity which actually opposes finite to infinite and posits infinite outside finite or finite outside infinite. But according to Hegel, if finite is outside infinite, it means infinite is not infinite because there's something outside limiting it. So yeah, so what Iqbal is saying is basically assuming this distinction, and he's saying that thinking that thinking is finite in a bad finite is a wrong conception of movement of thought, false conception of movement of thought in knowledge, which presupposes which thinks that being or infinity are opposed to thinking in a bad way. Yes, there is a distinction between finite and infinite, and that's why there's a movement. That's why we want to seek something we don't know, but that's only from the perspective of a genuine infinity, that is from the perspective of an infinity which has all this finite within itself. That's why knowledge is basically unfolding of our thinking, or as Plato said, remembrance or whatever. So yeah, let us go back to the text and see if it has become a bit clearer. Okay, so the idea that thought is essentially finite, essentially. So that's what I mean, essentially. So the thought would be considered essentially finite if we believe in bad infinity. A bad infinity is an infinity in which finite and infinite are outside each other. So the idea of thought is infinite. For this reason, unable to capture the infinite is based on a mistaken notion, false notion of the movement of thought in knowledge, because it thinks that thought is outside knowledge, essentially. But finite and infinite and thought and knowledge and thought and being are not essentially outside each other. In fact, all finite is within infinite. And historically speaking, that infinite is trying to realize itself, and from that perspective it appears to us as if that finite is opposed to infinite. But if we looked at from within, they are both related. Okay, anyway, more is coming, so if everything is not clear, it's fine. We will be looking at this again. Okay, thank you.